All right. Thanks so much, Rani. Thank you, everyone, for joining us here today. Thank you, Team Asia Pacific IGF, for giving this session a space in your session plan. My name is Disha. I'm joined by my colleague, Pratik Vagre. We represent Tech Global Institute, and I will shortly introduce us and our organization and the themes for this workshop and everything that we're going to be doing in the next hour. Till then, could I request everyone to introduce yourselves in the chat, network, get to know each other. This is going to be a conversation that brings everyone together. This is not just going to be, me speaking or, one of you or a few of us speaking. We're all going to be sort of building something together, hopefully, and trying to answer some questions and even asking more questions than we really had before we got here. Sorry about if you hear a cat in the background, that's Simba. He's very loud. And please let me know if it ever gets too much. But yeah, please take a few minutes to introduce each other and yourselves in the chat. So my name is Disha. I am a program manager looking at Asia Pacific as a region for Tech Global Institute. DPI and DPI Governance is one of the things that I work towards, and I'm just trying to get my bearings, because all of us, I think, in the room know that there's a lot that's been happening around DPI governance for some time now. I am based in India, and India has led some of these conversations for some time now, but we want specifically this session and this workshop to be more macroscopic. We want to zoom out a little bit. We want to look at the region. We want to understand perspectives from countries that haven't had perspectives or haven't had representation in this conversation for a while. Tech Global Institute is a policy lab. We work across the global majority to serve the needs of underrepresented and underserved communities when it comes to tech governance and digital rights. And DPI is a space where we all agree, I think everyone in the room and all policymakers agree that there is a dire need to have community representation and community participation, which is an intersection that TJ is very interested in exploring, and which brings me to the theme of this workshop, which is what does it mean to have meaningful community participation and multi-stakeholderism in DPI governance? And I'll be happy to give an overview of the session and of the kind of policy themes and questions we'll be covering. Rani, can we move to the next slide, please? The one after this. The one after this. Thank you. Yes. So just the next hour or less than an hour will entail the following. We will first look at what is a digital public infrastructure, what have been the policy efforts to define it, who have been the actors trying to define it, and why is it so important for us to define digital public infrastructure in a way that services all of our needs and a way that, represents the interests of all groups, especially the groups that are most affected by digital public infrastructure, which will bring us to the second discussion of why it's so important to have public and citizen representation in DPI governance. We then ask the question of what is community, because this entire session circles around representing community and participation from community. But what do we mean when we say community? And from there, we'll move on to what community-based harms could look like, what could be the impetus for community action and advocacy. So what are the kind of dangers and risks and other sort of safeguards we should be looking at when it comes to DPIs and how they interact with communities? Then we ask the question of, are communities able to participate in the current day and age, not only in DPI governance, but also in the conception, the design, the implementation, and all parts of the life cycle of a DPI tool. Then we ask questions about public-private partnerships and how they form a very solid basis of DPIs. Then we'll have a small breakout activity, and then we'll have some co-learning, some questions and some conversations around what we've sort of taken away from the session. At all points of this session, everyone's invited to raise their hand at any point in time. I will call on you. I will immediately sort of address any questions in the chat. I will also ask Pratik to help me with that. If there's a question in the chat that I've missed, please bring it to my attention. And let's make this a conversation. Please feel free to stop me at any point in time and, present your thoughts as well. Could we move to the next slide, please, Rani? Thank you so much. So I think with digital public infrastructure, a big roadblock that we hit since it came into the public conversation and public consciousness in 2023 is, what do we mean when we say digital public infrastructure? It's such like a vague terminology for something that's so specific and so highly technological and so highly motivated by sociology, economics, technology, all of the moving parts, right? So we've taken some time, I think, as a whole, as like a policy community in all of the world, to arrive at like a central definition of DPI. And a lot of people might still say that they don't agree. But I think what reductively we've all understood and we've all accepted is that DPIs are essentially they're the skeleton, they're the technological rails on which we built digitalized essential services and digital products and services that enable public benefits or meet public needs. And this happens at a very large scale, at a societal scale. It's not a small service product. It's not a boutique service. It's something that digitalizes existence for a lot of us, right? And some more markers that a lot of other policy actors have been able to arrive together at is that DPIs need to be reusable, and they can take several forms, but they should be able to be transmittable or transferable, right? Like you would have heard that India is in the process of exporting a lot of DPIs, and this can take the form of open source software, this can take a form of APIs, this can take multiple forms, wherein one DPI envisioned and built by one country or one context can be transferred and applied to several other contexts. And another part that people have realized, and it wasn't initially, a mandatory feature of DPIs, but has since evolved to be so, is that these are usually built with consensus or with corroboration between government and private individuals or private companies, the private sector generally. So these are very often we see technology provided by a private service provider, and then jointly the government provides the necessary data sets and the public infrastructure to make that technology at scale and make that accessible by a lot. So it's a joint effort essentially by these two actors, and it's something we call public-private partnerships. It's existed for a long time, but DPI sort of dominated that world recently. Can we move to the next slide, please, Nani? Here we look at it's a very wordy slide, so feel free to take a screenshot or whatever else. We look at how different actors have sort of come in to define different parts of what a digital public infrastructure is. The most recent and the most comprehensive tool we have currently on DPI governance specifically is the Universal DPI Safeguards Framework, which was envisioned by the tech envoy at UNDP. And it claims to be multilateral and multi-stakeholder. It has a lot of working groups that has representation from different quarters. So it does represent the kind of questions or answer the kind of questions we're trying to ask in this session. And they've been working on building multiple reports, and it's a living and breathing document of what safeguards should be when it comes to implementing or designing DPIs and delivering public service with safety and with regards to human rights. So this is a framework and a document which marries human rights interests with economic interests to a satisfying degree. And this is something that we right now are working with in the policy space to the largest extent possible. But besides that, we also have thematic participation from agencies at the UN, say the WHO, that looks at health digitalization, World Bank that looks at financial inclusion and that manner of like that side of DPIs. You have the ITU, you have India's presidency at the G20, which propelled some of these questions into public conversation. For instance, India has been sitting on an imagination of a DPI, which was called India Stack before 2023. And they sort of presented this idea that at G20 and the interests between DPI, what that looks like, a digital public good, what that looks like, and something like an India Stack was all like brought together and given the new definition, the new imagination of DPI that we have today. We have the Global Digital Compact, which is working towards the more sociological effects and impacts of DPI as well, and have those sort of conversations going on. The OECD and other actors, like University College of London, which you must have seen in the previous slide, and co-develop, and multiple other partners and actors coming together to try and define DPI and try to regulate it together. Like I said, this has been a really long conversation, about 2.5-3 years in the making now. But we have terms now that that are of the manner of open, reusable, inclusive, and public-private that define DPI. So now that we've defined DPI, the problem, or not essentially the problem, but the diagnosis here is that all of these actors that you're seeing on the screen are, international organizations or are organizations with certain agendas and interests in keeping with their functions. For instance, a World Bank framework will look at financial inclusion and the financial side of DPIs, and say an OECD will look at the trade side of DPIs, right? But what's lacking here is, was there enough conversation with people that are going to be affected and impacted by DPIs while defining DPIs? Can we move to the next slide, please, Nani? So here, this is the conversation then we must have, is that we've defined DPIs and we've used all these terminologies to define DPIs, but what is the public part of DPIs? We've talked about digital. It's that you're digitalizing rights and services and welfare benefits. We've talked about infrastructure, which is the technological rails on which you build these services. But what about the public? Is the public part of the terminology defined? Is the public part of the terminology arrived at through participation of the public? So now the several concerns that, or the questions that we should mull over today, is the fact that a technological framework or a rail or an infrastructure is not neutral. It's most often built by a state that may be known to, have inflicted harm on its people through technological or digital means in the past. It may be a digitally authoritarian regime. It might be built by a private sector player that does not hold consumer trust, or that's known for, say, data privacy breaches and other forms of harms. And it might be motivated, and building of this railing and this infrastructure might be motivated by certain needs and interests, which may not ultimately benefit the public. So understanding and questioning whether every DPI and every infrastructure we erect is actually serving the needs of the public and serving the public and putting the public in DPI or not. Now, this is a very important conversation, especially to have in context of global majority, or the global south, wherein across the region we have, we have a very distinct socio-political quality, that we tend to have communities, we tend to have vulnerable groups, we tend to have regimes that are not completely democratic. We tend to have a lot of these sociological and anthropological pushes and pulls that affect the way in which not only DPIs are implemented, but used by the people and by the several actors going forward. And the most important part here is that DPIs not just digitalize basic services, they digitalize lives of people, right? They digitalize objects and products and services that are life-saving, for instance, health and access to primary healthcare, or even some manners of surveillance tools and e-policing tools that end up affecting people in way deeper mechanisms and ways than it would in the global minority or in the global north. Also, the aspect of the private sector stepping in very largely and very substantially in a DPI setting means that whenever there is a country or a social context where there is mistrust between people and private sector, and there is loss of consumer trust, and there is exploitation of consumers in the way of data breaches or other sorts of exploitation, there is often a fear of corporate capture. There is often a fear that people will fall through the cracks if private sector takes over essential public services. And DPIs pose a very real risk of that happening, because there's a very large involvement of the private sector. And following from all of these needs, then there is the need for us to ask the question of how can we make sure communities, and we're all communities, right? We all represent a community, but how do we make sure every community interest and all community interest is represented? How do we make that happen? What does multi-stakeholderism mean? Multi-stakeholderism is a word that we've thrown around and we've seen a lot in internet governance and tech governance for years and years now. But what does that really look like in context of something that is so sensitive and so life-altering for so many of us and so many of the communities from where we come from? Right. And the question then I will throw to the room, and anyone can feel free to answer and have, I would really appreciate if there are any lived experiences or any examples from your own countries and contexts, is that, do all stakeholders need to be in the same room at all times? I'll give you an example of this. We wanted to have a candid conversation with civil society and understand how are they pushing back, maybe if they are, how are they pushing back against some really ridiculous digital ID systems or DPI systems being introduced in their countries. And one feedback that we got in that process was, we would love to participate, but can it just be civil society? It feels safer to have those candid conversations when it's just one homogenous group, as opposed to having a government figure in the room, or as opposed to having a really rich tech billionaire in the room, which influences and it skews power dynamics and makes people hold their tongues quite often. So my question to the room, and anyone can come in at this point, is what is your experience been with multi-stakeholderism, having conversations in the same room as people that you may not agree with? Are there any interventions at this stage? I'm just going to go through. Okay, in case there are no interventions, that's also good. That's also okay. And I may have, certain views of this and others may not. But I think it's very easy to say that there is a need for multi-stakeholderism at all points, but it's also important to note that the process of getting communities into the room, and in many of these cases, is very, very difficult. It's fraught with something as small as, say, a visa application sometimes, right? It's really, really difficult from the standpoint of making them feel included and safe, for instance, to come into the same room and sit at the same level as people that have had a hand in building systems that harm them. And that's the question that we have a hand up, sorry.
Hi.
Yes, please.
Sorry, I was just gonna speak to your previous question, if that's still okay. Cool.
Yeah, of course.
Hi everyone. My name is Anna McAllister. I am one of the fellows this year. I think my experience with multi-stakeholderism in my economy, which is New Zealand, is that it's very common to have spaces where there are multiple representatives across the kind of multi-stakeholder framework. But as a Māori woman, so an Indigenous woman to New Zealand, it's often very, very important that Māori also have their own clear spaces where we can just be amongst each other and speak really candidly and comfortably. So a bit of a balance across both, I would say. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really important intervention. And I agree. I think there's safe spaces to be preserved. There's also something to be said that do you think governments do governments need to have safe spaces like these? They often have these high-level meetings, which is very fair because there's issues of national security and importance to be discussed there. But those are often the rooms that, we as civil society also want to be a part of. We feel the need that we should be ultimately transparency is a pillar of governance, and we should be able to be in those rooms, and we should be able to understand the kind of dialogues that governments and private sectors have in closed rooms. So that's also a big consideration. But given the state of sociology and power dynamics at play, it's absolutely imperative for civil society and communities to have these safe spaces first. And not every room needs to be multi-stakeholder. Some spaces need to be safer. And then once maybe our interests are aligned, we take a united front to somewhere. So this is a very complicated discussion. And sometimes, it also so happens that governments and private sectors and other players that enjoy a higher power bring in like a tokenized version of a civil society group, or bring in representation just for the sake of representation, and those kind of like processes that sort of go around the spirit of multi-stakeholderism just to meet the legal framework and just to make sure that they've done the compliance and check market is also very common. So I think this is a question that I would encourage everyone to take home with them and see if in their own countries and contexts, are there enough safe spaces for civil society and communities to talk to each other, talk among themselves, and how those can be created as well. Rani, could we move to the next slide, please? Defining community, and this is going to be a very short one. And I'm, again, interested to hear from anyone who has thoughts. is that when we say community, what do we mean? Because, for instance, I've spoken to people who work on DPI, and they've used the word community a lot, and they've said, yeah, we worked with the community to build this API, to build this interface, build this tool, build that tool. And then I paused to ask, what do you mean by community? Like, who are these people that you're working with? And they said, oh, of course, tech community. Oh, of course, technologists. Oh, of course, people who've been involved in designing and engineering these spaces. So the idea of and the understanding of what a community is also varies so deeply across the room. And I also question whether civil society is community, right? Because we have civil society representation at multiple stages of DPI governance, because we want to show that level of representation. But can a civil society representative truly translate the interests of, say, a vulnerable tribal group, say a group that they have never spoken to before, right? So community is not homogeneous at all. There's a typo there. It's community is not homogeneous, not heterogeneous. And the current imaginations of how we treat community can have the opposite effect of what we really wanted to have. I also want to I think my understanding of how DPI has been rolled out, at least in my country, which is India, is that um, instead of users, and we've used the word users across policy instruments right now, even the DPI safeguards framework called people users of DPI. But the truth is that we often become subjects of DPI. There is the consent part of it, the consent that is paramount for you to become a user of something is missing. We often we have to deal with the DPI or a digital ID system when it comes up without having much room to negotiate around it. So understanding that users aren't really willing users sometimes of DPI, and engaging with them as someone that you're going to be impacting and affecting as a DPI engineer or a DPI person that's maybe conceptualizing a DPI is also really, really important. And it's okay for the word community or the concept of community to be heterogeneous. It's all right for you to be looking at maybe 8,000 different groups to talk to. For instance, if it's an ID that looks at education and child needs, your community's children, your community's parents, your community's teachers, your community's schools. So those communities can exist and coexist with each other, and their interests can be aligned as long as all of them are spoken to. This also brings me to the question, and possibly even like just a thought that I had is, we have something called community harms, which we will come to in a minute, that are more prevalent in the global majority world, in the global south, in low to middle income countries, which really don't they're not given much importance in the global DPI conversation, because the global DPI conversation as we have it today is propelled by the ICCPR framework, which is an excellent starting point, which covers a lot of political and individualistic rights of people. But it is essentially still a European framework. It is essentially still a global north-driven framework. How do we pull it back and bring it to more global majority contexts? By which I mean, when we talk about freedoms and liberties and the right to privacy, for instance, we talk about an individual. We talk about me as a citizen and my liberty, my freedom of speech, my right to privacy. But when you come down south, maybe look at some countries in the African context, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, you see that people exist as communities, people exist as groups, right? And there are the same rights, the right to self-determination, the right to private existence for a community, the right against surveillance, are all community rights. They have bearing on you as an individual, but they have a larger bearing on you as a community, whatever that community might be. It could be a religious community, it could be a socioeconomically underprivileged community, it could be anything, right? So that articulation of harms, the power imbalance that comes with community harms, is currently absent from the DPI governance conversation. We'll come to the question of how do we define community participation maybe a little later. We'll skip this question for now. Rani, can we go to the next slide? Because we're going to talk about community harms. So like I said, DPIs pose a much higher risk of inflicting harms to a community, along with inflicting harms on an individual. So the spectrum of harms is much wider than it would be in, say, a European context or an American context. And not only does it inflict harms, but it also shifts the way that we talk to each other, we interact with each other, we live our lives as part of communities. So like the next 4 bullet points are examples of this. First, if there is a DPI system being rolled out, say for instance, it's a digital ID system, and you as an individual don't want to participate in it, you don't feel right, or you don't want to give your data, because these systems also tend to be very data heavy. And if you choose not to enlist yourself, what follows is stigmatization and discrimination, not only against you, but your community. For instance, in India, there is a really like huge health digitalization drive underway currently. And there are a lot of vulnerable groups, say sex workers or drug users or people that live with HIV/AIDS, that don't want to enlist themselves in this ID because it asks for a lot of health data. And this health data that they possess is very private and protected by other existing laws in place in India. So them choosing not to participate in it can have the effect of outing them at some stage, right? If I'm living with HIV and I choose not to enlist in a digital ID that has centralized health medical records, and it's my unique ID, I choose not to participate in it, and I go to a hospital to receive benefits, and they ask me what my ID is, and I say I don't have it. They could arrive to the conclusion that I may be a person of interest. I may have, some sort of comorbidity. I may align with or belong to a community that is marginalized and further scrutinized. That can have an effect of when I go to claim insurance and they see that I've been flagged as someone that belongs to a risk group, my insurance premiums might get higher. So there is a whole string of discrimination and stigmatization and surveillance concerns that can arise out of me simply saying no to enrolling into a DPI or a digital ID system. That's one. And especially this need is more, I think, provoked and more inflated when it is a mandatory digital ID system. If I have to do it, there is just no other way. I'm exposing myself and I don't have an option of saying no. Biometric ID systems that are flowing across Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, following in the Aadhaar model from India, are very clear indicators of this. Biometric systems are becoming increasingly mandatory, and people who are at the risk of surveillance really don't have a real option to say no to it. The second point of this is people may be denied digital identity or denied participation in a DPI based on their group or their community affiliation as well. For instance, this may be happening currently in conversation in context of migration and refugee crisis, right? If you are at the risk of being identified as an illegal migrant by a state, or if you are a refugee, you may be denied access to your national biometric ID, you may be denied access to your farmer ID or your food security ID. And without those IDs and without participation in those DPIs, you really don't have an avenue of collecting those welfare entitlements. So as a result of this, you go hungry, you go unemployed, you lose out on essential state welfare services. And this is an emerging problem in context of migration, but it is also true for religious minority groups in many parts of South Asia. It's also true for tribes that continue to be, not seen as citizens of the state in many contexts in many parts of South Asia and Southeast Asia. So, given those concerns as well, you have the risk of losing out on very essential services and products by the pure reason of belonging to a certain group and community. Um, the third point is similar, right? You can be dissidents or people who work in the human rights space or activists or people who fight the system in any way that can be sort of retaliated against by freezing their IDs. And we've been seeing this increasingly in digitally authoritarian regimes in Asia, wherein speaking up can lead to you losing access to a lot of your IDs. Apart from the already existing risks of imprisonment and other fines, your personal data that may have been collected for a DPI system or a digital ID system can be used elsewhere to profile you, to surveil you, and to police you. So that angle of dangers adds a layer of danger to people who engage in the rights space anyway. And the last one, which is something that I'm very interested in learning, if there's any experiences and sort of things people would like to share in the group, is how digitalization can lead to disintermediation, or in simpler words, it can skew the local power dynamics of smaller communities and groups. I have a little bit of an anecdote about this. So, in the early days of the Indian biometric system, which is a mandatory ID called Aadhaar, when it was being rolled out, this would be back in 2010s. Um, a lot of people that lived in villages and they had low levels of digital and technological literacy would come out of their homes to collect their welfare entitlements in the form of food grain or ration or employment. And whenever they reached there, the shopkeeper, the fair price shopkeeper would ask for their thumbprint and their iris scans. And the people would not understand what this means, and they would not understand of course, when they don't understand what the tech is, they don't understand what the repercussions of giving away that data is. So they said, no, we're not engaging in this. It's very mysterious. It seems dangerous. The shopkeepers often use the language of, no, you have to do this. This is the will of our prime minister. If you like our prime minister, you have to do it for him. Otherwise, he'll come and, he'll retaliate, etc. Or the other line of argument that they would use is, you don't really have a choice. We're not giving you a ration. Or the third possibility of this is that they would force them to give a thumbprint and then keep their food grain with them. The shopkeepers would essentially keep the food grain or not give it to them or say that, no, this didn't happen in the correct manner. There was some error. And then the person at the end, the person who's come to collect their food grain would walk away home empty handed. There are a lot of dynamics that get skewed. People that already enjoy a certain degree of power in hyperlocal settings, in tribes or villages, like landlords or shopkeepers, started to get this upper hand. And not just this, but in cases of right now in India, there is this massive problem where really old people that live in really rural and remote areas are being declared dead by algorithms, just for no fault of their own. They're very much alive and they're awaiting their pension from the state. But instead of receiving their pension, a computer system is declaring them dead and not disbursing their pension anymore. And whenever these really, really old people, by some means, try to they reach an office to raise their complaints, they are often told, we don't know, it's the computer that has decided, don't ask us, the state is not responsible. So there are multiple ways in which your existence as a community member, as a part of the community, gets completely skewed and completely, like, your reality gets a little shaken up when things are digitalized and you don't know what's happening. If anyone else has experiences like these that they would like to share, or comments or questions at this stage on community harms, I'm very keen to hear. Feel free to also just unmute or put it on the chat. We can go through your interventions. Okay, I think we are good to move. Okay, cool. Thanks, Rani. So now I think with the articulation of those harms, once we understand what it means to be a part of a community or a vulnerable group or a marginalized group as a DPI subject, the question then arises, can we even participate? Can we really truly participate in making a DPI, implementing a DPI, governing a DPI, auditing a DPI? So I think many actors have looked into this question. World Bank has looked into this question, for instance. This is just an example from the idea or from the lens of financial inclusion, and how deeply are we able to penetrate into remote and rural areas and get them to learn about their financial abilities and get them to ease into it, essentially, right? Financial inclusion is a huge part of DPIs. It's one of the it's I think a lens we've not focused on today as part of this session, but it's something that World Bank, OECD, and many other actors are very deeply invested in. So this is a 2024 assessment from World Bank, which itself found that in these countries that you can see on the screen, Bangladesh, Ecuador, Guatemala, Indonesia, Jordan, Kenya, Mozambique, and Philippines, recipients who benefited from any DPI system or the digital financial tool that has taken the form of DPI were mainly younger men with some prior knowledge of technology. So this barred a lot of other sectors, as you can tell, anyone that is not a young man and who doesn't really understand something as basic as what a one-time password is, is often not interacting with this system. It's often not benefiting from a DPI, often not really feeling financially included in the scheme of things, right? So this is an example of, not an example, but something that we need to worry about or ask ourselves questions about, is that you've democratized financial abilities and the ability to make payments, but who is really being able to engage with this? And this is an example of how communities are engaging with DPIs by using them. But what about governing DPIs? And what about making and designing and implementing those DPIs, right? There are some factors that structurally impede meaningful participation from communities. And those are that often communities in the global majority tend to have low digital literacy rates, or they may not have network. They may not have, even internet access. If they have internet access, if everything else works out, they might have accessibility issues, like they don't know how to navigate an OTP, which is something that we, I think, realized as a region during the COVID pandemic, is that I think India led efforts to digitalize the vaccination drive, and it's called CoWIN, and that was also transferred between many other countries in the region. And CoWIN was based on a very key feature of being able to have a one-time password. But how many of us, and really in the rural and remote pockets, know what an OTP is and how to navigate it? There are also huge concerns about disability-friendly processes, which is a whole other discussion, and those communities are already talking about how to fix this. There are technological glitches, like the kind of machines you're interacting with in remote paths to claim your entitlements, to enroll yourself for employment, or you claim your food grains, like I brought up. Those don't work. And lastly, and the most important point that I think is really super important to this discussion, is to what extent is the state letting us participate in this, right? State-imposed shutdowns and internet being slowed down or throttled in disturbed areas or areas where there is some dispute going on is really picking up steam. It's picked up steam in India, which came out as the internet shutdowns capital of the world last year. It's picked up steam in Sri Lanka following the economic turbulence. It's picked up steam in Bangladesh following their election-related turmoil last year and the July uprising. And this is something that we as a region need to be very conscious of and very invested in, is the state really allowing us to participate in digital public infrastructures and allowing us to not just engage with them from a user, but also in its governance and its implementation. There is a question in the comment, which I will defer to now. Is digital ID the only DPI that is problematic? Do you think there should be a digital ID in the first place? Is from Albin. Alvin, thank you for that question. And I think this can be anyone from the group could also please respond to this. Digital ID is one form of DPI. It's digital identity, although as a concept, is key to DPI. When you participate in a DPI mechanism, you create a digital identity of yourself and for yourself, and you use it to then access those services. So yes, it is a component of DPIs. DPIs are often split into layers, wherein you have a layer, a payments layer, in processes layer, and then there's one identity layer. So there is, yes, digital identity is key to be able to access a DPI. However, it becomes problematic when it becomes mandatory, right? Mandatory digital IDs are things that we have, as a civil society, as a united front, we have opposed and we've questioned for years and years now. Why does any digital identity have to be mandatory? And even when they're not mandatory, some countries have been following something called voluntary mandatory, especially in South Asia, wherein they'll say that it's voluntary for you to sign up for this ID or not, but in practice, they will deny you all access. They will tell their employees of the state to not give you anything unless you present that ID. So in practice, it becomes mandatory, even though legally on paper it's voluntary. So we have very interesting systems like these coming up in the region. And personally, I think, and TGI is of the view that mandatory digital IDs have no place, especially in the global majority world. And digital identity should be completely voluntary and be protected by a million safeguards that we're here to discuss. Yes, Vietnam as well. Vietnam has also seen activity when in terms of closing off of like digital borders and trying to like control population's access to the internet as well. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Yeah, very quickly, we're going to run through the public-private question. Now, what I mean by this is, very interestingly, in DPI, it's not just the state that we're talking to. Very often, when we as civil society or we as communities have a lot of anger and a lot of frustration with processes and systems where we're like, we're not sure how to engage with this, and this is very problematic, deeply hurtful, deeply harmful, we often go to the state and we often, use democratic processes to make our voices heard. But what about the private sector, which has an equal involvement, if not more, in envisioning DPIs? How are we really, engaging with that side of the world? One question that arises, and it is similar to Albin's question on digital ID, is that can a private entity issue us a digital ID? Isn't our existence as citizens based on a social contract with the state? It's the state that issues us identification, right, in all parts of life. Why are private entities able to um, issue us digital identity? What bearing, what process in law, and what validation in law do we have to be able to do that? So that's an open-ended question that I think the World Bank and UNDP have also asked in their recent instruments. And then the question we want to bring to the table and like ask everyone is that we need to shift focus a little bit from our state-based advocacy to also doing advocacy with private sector, to also talking to the private sector and understanding their role in the system and making them aware of their responsibilities and obligations to us as consumers, if not citizens. So my question that follows is that how do you guys have any experiences dealing with the private sector and putting across your worries and your concerns to the private sector in your countries and your contexts? How do you do that? And then the next question that follows, and you can answer either of these questions, is does multi-stakeholderism, the idea of multi-stakeholderism, include giving an equal space to the private sector? We've spoken about state and civil society, but what about the private sector? In the meantime, I will look at comments and questions, but please take a minute to raise your hand, think about this, and come back. One question that has come on the chat is the comment by Maria is very well noted. Is that every new technology has to have a trust building phase. I think the reason why DPIs, sorry, I got distracted. The reason why DPIs have sort of maybe lost that trust a little bit is because, like I said, they are imposed on the people rather than optionally, implemented. And when you impose a technology on people that don't really know what's going on, that trust, you already enter a trust deficit. The next question that has come up is, do you think there's any reason why digital ID implementation is not yet implemented in countries like Sri Lanka? I think it's about a matter of time because there's been a very heavy adoption and very heavy appreciation for certain kinds of DPI. For instance, payment system, the unified payments interface coming out of India has been very largely adopted by Asian countries. So it could be a matter of time. It could be many other factors, maybe technological capacities as well. So yeah, Nirosha, if that answers your question. I think in the interest of time, we have about 16 minutes left. So we're gonna now move, can we go to the next slide, please, Nani, to a breakout activity. And there is, I see, a lot of you in the room. So Rania might need your help in coordinating this a little bit. But essentially, what we would like for all of us to do, and maybe this is a space where you can answer all those previously unanswered questions in the slides, is that we'll break out in 3 groups essentially, and we can randomize. I think, Rani, if I can have your help in randomizing people in the group, we can all, I think, roughly divide about 20 people in one group. And between me, Pratik, and Rani, we can possibly be in one group each to facilitate. The idea is that all of you join. So we are back to the main session. I understand that I think this was a very small window of time to do something like this, but we have at least in our group, where we're trying to build a digital ID, digital health ID the government was very keen on collecting all the data possible and keeping it within ourselves and storing all of it ourselves. The private sector was very keen on, partnering with the government, bringing in money from elsewhere and helping them with the budget and erecting technological infrastructures on their behalf. And the civil society said, tell us what's happening. We don't have any trust. You need to tell us exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it so that we are able to participate meaningfully. Are there any other reflections from other groups?
I can very quickly go for Group B. I'll just add that. So, it didn't actually go into the specific roles, but there was, some comments around specifically the role that, and the tool could play as serving as a base, a good base for a process that farmers could, the farming community could use, but that it would need other safeguards on top of it.
So yeah, that's a really good start. Group C, anything from you? I'm trying to make an education ID.
Sure. This is Edmund and reporting. Sorry, there was a little bit of confusion from what we were going to do and Group C, but Shamima was saying something, although I didn't catch very well. Just leave a few seconds for Shamima to finish her thoughts.
Shamima, do you want to come in?
Yes, I was saying this, we should maintain in our education system all the technology uses for their education rights, for their human rights. So we need, we're presently seeing that all students are facing analog system, exam and class tasks, everything. So they are very inclusion with ICT tools, technologies, social media, lots of apps, but they are facing analog system in the exam. So we should need at the DPI system that including public-private participation OA, we should need exam at least should be 50% with technology based and 50% with analog. Otherwise, youth group, Gen Z group will be not stand or will be not success their education life. This is my opinion. Thanks.
Oh, that's fair. Of course, when it comes to, if you're trying to digitalize one part of the student experience, you must digitalize the whole thing. This is one of the questions that we grapple with. How can you digitalize one part of life and not the other? And of course, it's not a challenge to the government or the private sector to do that. But the question, again, what we've learned today and having listened to everybody in the breakout sessions or otherwise, what we've understood is there is a trust deficit. There is a lack of communication from the state or private sector to the citizens. We don't have to be us versus them. There need not be that civil society and communities only talk to each other and state and private talk to each other in closed rooms. That need not happen. True multi-stakeholderism means true involvement and participation from all quarters and their opinion and their inputs having equal value. Sometimes it doesn't need to have equal value, but maybe you need to highlight and platform the concerns of the people that you're making the technology for, the citizens, the communities, right? And that's where we say that multi-stakeholderism is great, but civil society and communities need to have their own spaces and need to have a much, much louder voice in the governance ecosystem. With that, it's the last 40 seconds. There are more interventions in the chat. So I'm going to go through these once the chat is saved and once we're able to revisit this conversation. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining on a Sunday there too. Thank you so much, APrIGF, for hosting this session. And I had a really fun time talking to everybody, and I hope this was a helpful session for everyone. We, I think, should be able to access these the slideshow and other material post IGF. I'll leave that up to the organizers. But thank you so much and hope you all have a wonderful day ahead full of really, really cool sessions. I'll see you guys around. Thank you, Rani, for all of your help as well. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Disha. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.